follow us on Facebook and stay up to date on everything PBS Books. Check out our schedule of upcoming virtual events and catch up on the ones you've missed. It's all available on the PBS Books Facebook page. Thanks for tuning in to this PBS Books virtual event. Check out pbsbooks.org and follow us on Facebook to stay up to date on all of our events. Stay tuned. The event is about to begin.
We have this incredible book talk. So we have Dr. Justin Sledge. He is another multi-hyphenate. I feel like it's the theme of the evening. Everybody does 1,000 things. He's a professor of religion and philosophy here in Detroit, where he hosts a popular YouTube channel, Esoterica, with nearly 500,000 subscribers. And if you are in that world, that's a lot of subscribers we were discussing. His expertise is in Western esotericism. He's got a background, he studies a background of early modern occultism and alchemy, magic, Kabbalah, Hermetic philosophy, and he's an absinthe distiller. I mean, all those things.
We tried it too.
All those things.
This is true.
Yeah, it's true. Adam Mansbach, I am not allowed to say the actual title of your book that became a #1 New York Times bestseller. Go the F to Sleep, which is a cult classic, as well as Rage is Back, The End of the Jews, The Angry Black White Boy. All these titles are really confusing, Adam. You have us all thinking. And tonight he's going to talk about The Golem of Brooklyn, another one that has us thinking. And our moderator, who I had the pleasure to meet tonight, and I'm so excited because we're now going to be friends. I hope that's okay. I'm not stalking you. She is the president and CEO of the Skillman Foundation, a private independent foundation that puts all its resources toward brilliant Detroit youth, their justice, their power, and their promise. She has an intense passion for catalyzing new ways of thinking about racial equity and social justice, which can be seen throughout all of her work. So we're delighted that you're going to lead us through this conversation, Angelique. And her daughter just had a bat mitzvah. So mazel tov to Angelique. Thank you for going through all these introductions, but this is like an amazing celebration of Detroit artwork and some like secret Jewish artistic and creative treasures. So thank you for joining us. Come on up. Yeah, come here.
You're at that end. Yep.
And then they're going to talk for like 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions.
Someone sit here.
Hi, everybody. So first, can we say that if there are folks over here that want to sit down, I saw like 5 or 6 seats. And so if you're sitting next to an empty seat, will you welcome someone next to you so that they can chill, be relaxed, join us? Thank you, Reboot. Thank you, Third Man Records. I'm Angelique Power. As Gretchen said, I'm the president of the Skillman Foundation. I'm a member of the Downtown Synagogue. And yes, that's my rabbi over there, who is amazing. And I'm also a board member at Detroit Public Theater. I'm a reluctant moderator tonight. And the reason is because first I was reluctant because I thought because my daughter became a bat mitzvah, I wouldn't have time to read the book. And so I won't ask how many of you have yet read the book, but I will tell you that I opened it up, I read a paragraph, I'm like, I'm just gonna read a paragraph, and then I couldn't put it down. And I read all weekend long, walking from room to room, at times doubled over laughing, at times frozen, and just gripped by not only the great writing and the great dialogue, but the relevance of this story right now. And so I have so many questions that I want to dive into. But let's start with the basics. How many here know what a golem is? Did everybody walk in the room knowing what a golem is? Okay, all right. Justin, can you help us, educate us? What is a golem and how has it shown up in Jewish mysticism?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And I guess the other question is, how many people here are a golem? Also, I'll say Halloween Sameach. We're knocking on the... Just to... The word golem is a strange word for an appropriately strange creature. It only occurs once in the entire Hebrew Bible, once in Psalm 139. So it's a word that only appears once, and of course Jews would make that one-time appearance, the big monster they're going to deal with. The golem is an artificially animated anthropoid, which is to say it's a creature brought to life through artificial means. So in the tradition, the earliest mentions of golems are in the Talmud, well, depending on who you believe, it's Jews, right? Is either in the Talmud, but in that case, we have both an artificial human that's brought to life, although mute, and then also in that text, we have first actually brought to life an artificial calf, which the rabbis who bring it to life slaughter and eat for Shabbat. So you can have golem brisket. I'm not sure how good that is. So a golem is a creature brought to life through the power of the righteous. And I'm remiss to say magic, because it's very clear for the rabbis in the Talmud that golem making is not magic, because magic is a death penalty case. You're not allowed to do magic in Judaism, but you can bring people to life. You can create artificial people. And so the golem is an artificial person. How is it brought to life? Depending on the text that you read. I have a couple of books here about how to make a golem if you want to. Typically, it's done through the divine power of speech. And as you may know, in Judaism, God speaks creation into being. So one uses speech to bring the golem into being. However, in a fantastic 14th century French text, you dance the golem into being, which is another kind of, you circle around the golem in a kind of mystical dance, and you literally bury the golem in the ground and rise them up, chanting and dancing around the golem. So it's an artificial person, but it could also be an artificial animal.
I'm surprised I haven't danced a golem into being yet, but I will work on that.
There's still time.
Like by accident even.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, like college years. So now that we understand this, can you give a quick overview of this book, The Golem of Brooklyn?
Sure. So traditionally the golem, as Justin said, is animated by a rabbi or a very learned and holy man, always at a time of crisis, immediate crisis, not like the existential existence of anti-Semitism in the world, but like the villagers have lit torches and they're marching toward us. And the word truth, the Hebrew word for truth, is always a part of the animation of the golem, either written on its forehead or written on a piece of paper that's inserted into its mouth. The golem comes to life, obeys or fails to obey its master, restores some semblance of peace and order, or doesn't, and then is de-animated. I'm trying to avoid using words like alive or dead, because strictly speaking, the golem is neither alive nor dead. He's just up and about, or he's not. The golem is de-animated by turning the word truth into the word death. In my book, things work a little differently. The creator of the golem in my book does not create him at a time of crisis, nor is he a learned, wise, or religious man. He's just a regular schmuck. And he's an art teacher in Brooklyn who happens to have a tremendous amount of clay on hand and also happens to be extremely stoned. So he manages to animate this golem. The golem immediately starts screaming at him in Yiddish, which Len does not understand, and trashing his apartment. So Len runs out to find a Yiddish speaker. The only person in his neighborhood in Williamsburg that he knows speaks Yiddish is a woman he's never spoken to who works at a local bodega. We will find out that her name is Miri, and that she grew up in a Hasidic sect nearby, which she left at 18 because she's gay. She's been working in this Yemeni bodega ever since. She is unwilling to come back to this stranger's weird apartment and translate for him. But the golem does indeed learn English by binge-watching Curb Your Enthusiasm after ingesting a large amount of LSD. At which point we learn two things. One is that the golem has been screaming predominantly the phrase, "Where is the crisis?" because it's unthinkable to him that he could have been created in the absence of an immediate danger. The other thing we learn about the golem, and this is where my golem most profoundly, I think, differs from the golems of myth and lore, is that we learn the golem is a creature in possession of an ancestral memory. So Len has not made the golem, he has remade the golem. There's only ever been one golem. And as such, he's kind of a repository of Jewish history and trauma. Two words that are practically synonymous, of course. This also means that in the book, I can move backward in time to different iterations of the golem and reveal some of his previous adventures in 5th century Babylon, 11th century Spain, and so on. Len and Miri, the reluctant translator, and the golem embark on kind of a twisting and turning adventure. We learn also that the golem's last appearance on Earth happened in Kiev, Ukraine in 1941, when he was riddled with machine gun bullets by German soldiers and dumped into the Baban Yar Gorge alongside 33,000 other Jews murdered in a 36-hour period. And he sort of passes out of memory at that point. There's the suggestion that after that point, no one ever thought to remake him because the nature of the mechanized, large-scale horror of the Holocaust rendered the services of a large mud goon irrelevant. But he was last made by the Grand Rebbe of a sect in the Ukraine. One of the 25 survivors of that massacre was that man's grandson, who 81 years later is now the Grand Rebbe of the sect that Miri grew up in and escaped from. So the golem, largely in an effort to not work for this putz who made him, requests an audience with that Grand Rebbe. And then a bunch of other stuff happens. But eventually, in answer to the golem's persistent questions about where the crisis is, Miri shows him on her phone footage of the Charlottesville 2017 Unite the Right, Tiki Torch, Jews will not replace us marchers. She's like, here's the crisis. This is who's trying to kill the Jews. The golem is like, now we're getting somewhere. Where are those guys? And it so happens that in a couple of days' time, there is a rally scheduled in Wagner, Kentucky, which I made up. Kentucky is real. The name of the rally is the Save Our History's Future Rally. And it's going to attract a similar demographic, and the golem demands to be taken there. So Len, Miri, and the golem embark on a road trip to Wagner, Kentucky. At some point in the journey, Len and Miri realize that they don't really understand the golem's intentions. So they pull over in West Virginia and ask him, and they're like, you're just going to scare them, right? The golem is like, no, the golem going to kill everybody. They're like, oh, this is not good. Eventually, they'll all make their way to this rally. And eventually, Len and Miri will sort of be faced with an ethical conundrum on which they find themselves divided. And in its essence, what it comes down to is the fact that you can let the golem run amok and slaughter the enemies of the Jews, in which case you might be safe for once. But also on some basic moral, spiritual level, you might no longer be Jewish. That's option one. Option two is that you kill the golem. That's basically the book.
That's a great synopsis. This isn't one of my preset questions, but I was thinking when I was reading it, so Len, Miri, Leopold, Molly, are you doing a direct conversation with James Joyce, Ulysses?
I'm not nearly that smart.
Seemed like it. I was like, oh, I see something here. Okay, so I want to talk about this. One of the most tripped out things was what you both were talking about of emet, truth, written on the forehead, and if you smear the aleph, it becomes met, death, and then the golem is deactivated. So what is the connection or the, difference? Why are these these binary differences? It is either truth or it is death. Justin, what would you say? And then Adam, what are you asking the reader to think about with that?
I think that this idea of the truth-death thing doesn't occur until much later into the golem myth. It's a much more later medieval trick. But I think that what's important about it is the core conception of what animates the golem, and that's the sacred power of language. That even the term abracadabra, I'm sure you've heard abracadabra, it means I create as I speak in sort of garbled Aramaic. For the Jewish imagination, speech, language, creation, and reality are all the same thing. They're all tied together. And so it's very core to this idea of the golem that the word emet, right, when you spell it, aleph, mem, tav, right, that erasing that aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, it deanimates. And it's not just that truth and death are arbitrary things in the Jewish imaginary and Kabbalah, is that God creates through speech. And that a God, being a God of truth, once the truth is erased, there's nothing left than death. And so it's core to threading the ideas of how Kabbalah works, the centrality of language and creation, the centrality of language and uncreation. And those two things are always intimately linked in the Kabbalah, not just with golem creation, but even the creation of creation itself. In fact, the Talmud says that if you are righteous enough, you could create olamim, you could create worlds, not just golems. Golems are like, you made a golem, right? But the righteous, if you're really righteous, you could create universes. And so this is a place where Judaism and, for instance, perhaps Christianity are very different. In Judaism, there's a sense that not only can you do supernatural things to create incredibly powerful magic, but you can do more than that. You could be like God. You could create a world too, if only you're righteous enough. And that's always done through speech.
For me, on a more kind of literary level, not nearly as scholarly or well-informed a level, the notion that when the golem is alive, truth has been animated suggests to me that when the golem is around, you are coming face to face with the rawest of truths, the truth that danger is present and is forever present. And when the golem is deactivated, perhaps you're going from that heightened state of awareness, that heightened state of engagement with the ugliness of reality, back into a state where you have regained a measure of peace. It's transitory, but you're able to tell yourself that it's permanent and that you are no longer in need of this protection. That leads me to think about, both in the book and outside the bounds of the book, why is it that the golem is always deactivated as soon as the danger passes, right? Like, why not keep a standing army of golems? Why not make 100 golems? Why not make 1,000 golems? Why not make one golem 100 feet tall and never deactivate him? And I think the answer is that the act of creating a golem, although it's on one hand godlike, it's also an instance of creating something that is so powerful that we cannot control it, creating something that has no inherent morality of its own, so has to be governed by our fledgling morality, our liminal, imperfected morality. And if we were to keep such a being alive, we would be, in some sense, compromising our own humanity too much. Like, keeping a standing army of golems might keep us safe, but again, it might prevent us from, on a deep level, engaging with the most righteous and important parts of ourselves.
So it seems like there's so many, thank you for that, there's so many questions that you're calling with this book. Your editor, Chris, wrote something really interesting about that. He said, ultimately, the book is an allegory designed to wrestle with the question, I haven't found the exact words for the question, but it's something about how all of us who are Americans, especially if we're immigrants or descendants of immigrants or Black or et cetera, have an aspiration to live in a country that is secular, universal, ecumenical, multicultural, tolerant, et cetera, the Brooklyn of our imaginations, free of generational burdens of hostility and trauma, free to be ourselves. And Len, the main character, represents this wish, to live as if the world is healed and he is free. But the golem represents the opposite. It is consciousness. Its consciousness is composed entirely of generational trauma. It does not believe the world's atrocities can be healed, but only violently avenged. It is all militance and tribal instinct. And the book is asking the question, which one is right? So,
shout out to Chris, really, you know.
is this the central question of the book?
I think in some ways it is, yeah. I mean, I see it as, you know, when one of your main characters is the golem, he is not going to be the focus of the moral dilemma because he is sort of not immoral but amoral, right? He's not animated with a sense of morality. So the people around him have to be the ones fighting those fights. And ultimately, Len and Miri, in some ways, end up on opposite sides of that fight. As the events of the book unfold, it becomes clearer and clearer to Miri that what the golem ought to become in this newest incarnation is a standing deterrent, a nuclear threat, a figure whom anti-Semites will always have to look for in the shadows. She basically wants to turn him into a superhero, which is kind of ironic since in some ways the golem is like the template for all the superheroes who were created by all of the Jews who wrote comic books, you know, throughout the 20th century. He's a little bit Ben Grimm from the Fantastic Four, canonically Jewish, by the way. He's a little bit the Incredible Hulk. You know, he's a mishmash of all of these ideas with a little of Frankenstein's monster thrown in. In her estimation, he should be allowed to persist. He should not be unmade. It's time for a change. It's time to recognize that anti-Semitism is ineradicable, and also that it is at the heart of the praxis and the ideology of white supremacy and white nationalism writ large, which, as Chris suggests in that quote, also afflicts and affects Black folks, immigrants, gay, lesbian, and trans folks, a wide array of people who are not white in this country and who never will be. Len, on the other hand, who, unlike Miri, is not raised in a Jewish tradition. Len is observant only in the sense that he notices things. I'm trying that one out. Yeah, all right. Len ends up on the opposite side because Len, despite not really coming from a deeply Jewish background in terms of his learning, his religiosity, his observance, he has what he considers to be bedrock, deeply felt Jewish values that govern him and lead him to believe that this is anathema to the spirit of Judaism as he understands it. So this is sort of the dilemma between the two of them. I don't disagree with Chris that the golem represents this kind of vigilance against hate and this recognition that hate will never go anywhere. That is all true. But since he's not a moral being per se, it's up to these human characters to kind of battle out what the meaning and future of the golem looks like.
So, Justin, I did some light internet stalking about you. And first, I should have known that you're married to Rabbi Alana Alpert, who is like one of the coolest humans on the planet. So mazel on that. That was very good. And then part of your bio that I loved, it says, Dr. Sledge's work seeks to grasp the philosophical commitments which underpin the alleged workings of magic, esoteric influence, spirit possession, alchemy. What does this mean?
No idea. Sounded good on the internet. I think what it means is that there's an exoteric story we tell about history. There's a story we tell about Isaac Newton, for instance, right? It's the guy that invented calculus and did physics and color. And also then we forget that Isaac Newton wrote about 10 times more about alchemy and Bible prophecy. Really, he was a hobbyist when it came to physics. It was kind of a thing he did on the side. So we tell a story about history that I think really mismanages history. We tell a story about rationalism and enlightenment and democracy, but the truth of the matter is these are all very fraught categories, and that magic and mysticism set completely at ease with logic and science for the most of human history. And the fact that we've separated them now, and not separated them, but put them opposed to one another, I think we've actually distorted our ability to understand history. And I think the Golem is a fantastic example of this, that one of the things that we have gotten consistently wrong in history is that we've forgotten that technology always goes faster than morality, that we can create weapons far faster than we can learn to wield them, if we should ever wield them at all. And I think that the Golem is a cautionary tale in that regard, that it is a power that human beings have, but it's a power that once it gets out of our grips, it can cause all kinds of chaos and problems. So I think that what I do is that I say, let's actually look at history not from these bizarre categories that we've developed and impose upon it. Let's let these people from history tell us what they were up to. And one of the fun things about, I'll link it back to the Golem, is that in many cases the way we tell the Golem story now is that he's the central character of a story. He's the Maharal's Golem or other. It's amazing if you read most medieval Golem stories, they're things like housekeepers. They're mentioned in passing. Like, I went to this town, and I met Solomon ibn Gabirol, and then I met his Golem housekeeper, and she was quite pleasant, and then I did this. And you're like, you what? And so I love how the fact that this technology, the Golem as a technology, was kind of somewhat ubiquitous in the Jewish world. Whereas now we would think of it as magical and extraordinary and it's worthy of a movie. Back then they were like, yeah, my uncle has a golem. My brother has a golem. You don't have a golem? You're paying? So I love to mine out this stuff and show that that our vision of how the past worked is often misinformed by our present.
Adam, the Golem can smell anti-Semitism in your book. It has a stench, and he can smell it. And there's really a question toward the end of the book, and you talked about it a little bit. Is it best to scare people or try to scare people out of their base instinct to do harm on behalf of bigotry? Or is it best to proactively seek to destroy them? And you quote, or you have Mary quote the Talmud, saying, "Rise and kill first those who would kill you." This is such a relevant question. Yeah. What do you want the reader to do with this question?
Well, since you brought up the Talmud, in my view, the most important task of literature is to raise more questions than it answers. If I had answers, if I could sum up what I want the reader to do or turn this book into a line of instruction, I would just get a can of spray paint and make a stencil and spray that message on the sides of buildings. I think the role of literature is complexity. I think that there's nothing quite as Jewish and specifically as Talmudic as raising a question that you decline to answer or admit your inability to answer. The Talmud does say that, but by no means is that an agreed upon conclusion in the Talmud. Very little in the Talmud is agreed upon. That's why it's 6 billion pages long. That's why it's an argument over every element of custom and law. That's why these guys spend pages and pages debating over whether if you throw a divorce scroll over the parapet to your soon-to-be ex-wife standing on the roof and it catches on fire in midair, whether it can be considered delivered. And it really depends on whether it's on the updraft or the downdraft. So, like, this is not a document invested overly in pat conclusions. So it's more important to me to raise the question and leave the reader in a state of perplexity and pondering of all of the possible answers than it is to purport to have those answers myself.
Adam, I was actually wondering when I read that in the book that the golem could smell anti-Semitism. There's a great line in the Talmud about the Messiah, that the Messiah has the ability to smell and judge. That's one of the traits that we know of the Messiah, is they can know whether you've been naughty or nice by smell. Santa Claus. But is that something you picked up, or are you just a secret Kabbalist?
I haven't gotten that far in the Talmud. I didn't know that.
Not believing it, folks. Not believing it at all. He has the old
Giving
thing
you
memorized.
lots for future. You could just be like, yeah, I did that. I did, yeah.
What I meant to say is, yeah. No, that was very intentional. Also, that thing about James Joyce, I was just kidding. That was absolutely intentional.
So sticking on this topic, Judaism is not homogenous. It's not a homogenous religion. We each have different ways of observing Judaism in this room and in the world. We have different experiences. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that we are in a moment of war right now. I don't know about the rest of you, but social media is pretty brutal to look at. And regardless of your positionality, because everybody I know, whether you are of the same religion or background, has a different feeling. It's not a homogenous reaction to what's going on either. I find that there's almost a trial. Judaism is on trial a little bit right now. People are confusing policy with the religion and with people. And so I find myself trying to put out in the world my own humanity-centered version of Judaism as an antidote to that trial. And so there's a part in the book where the golem performs a conversion of an 11-year-old witch named Lena. And he does it through the story of, Hillel standing on one foot, summing up Judaism by saying, basically in essence, treat people the way you want to be treated. The rest is just commentary. And he puts his foot down and then he lifts it up again and he says, and he adds to this. This is not a moral being, but he adds the notion of tikkun olam, of repair of the world. And so what is the book saying about what it means to be Jewish? And Justin, what is your take on what it means to be Jewish right now?
You go first. You wrote the book. I'm gonna dip out.
That's fair. Well, first of all, thank you for asking me about that scene. I've been on book tour for more than a month and nobody's brought that scene up, which is weird to me. I mean, granted, there's like a lot of scenes in the book, but still. The golem finds himself in need of a ride to Kentucky. And he makes the acquaintance of this 11-year-old girl who says she's a witch in the middle of the woods. And she brings him home to her father and arranges a bargain by which the golem will dig them a septic tank, like a septic field, like a large septic field in their yard, which they desperately need to replace, in return for this ride to Kentucky. The problem is that the golem is structurally incapable of working for Gentiles. So in order for him to do this work, one of them has to convert. The girl's father is willing until he learns about circumcision. So instead, the golem converts this 11-year-old girl. And he invokes the story of Hillel. And then, yes, he adds this sort of addendum about tikkun olam, which is a concept that we've heard a bit about throughout the book. Len has a relationship to it. It's what he wrote his bar mitzvah speech about, in fact. And it comes up at the end of the book, the very end of the book, when Miri and Len are facing off on opposite sides of this dilemma. And Len, in a kind of desperate last pitch attempt to convince Miri of his viewpoint, is like, Miri, what about tikkun olam? I.e., like, we cannot let a golem rampage through the world. We are meant to repair the world. And Miri is like, my dude, has it ever occurred to you that this is how we repair the world? And that's basically the end of the book. You should still read it, though. There's like other stuff in it. I'm gonna let you take it, Justin. Maybe I'll think about a further addendum to my answer while you wax brilliant over here.
I don't know what Judaism says, but I wish that among the 600 and some odd commandments, there was one that says, thou shalt not use social media. The world might get a little repaired through that, says the YouTuber. I think what I like, one of the many things I liked about your book, Adam, is that there's an really easy Kabbalistic read of it. And again, I'm really convinced you're not so secret Kabbalist over here. And I love the fact that the golem represents gevura, just untamed justice. Justice that's not checked by chesed. It's not checked by mercy. And maybe the central tension in Jewish theology through Kabbalah is that evil in Judaism isn't some angel rebelling against God. Evil is God's own righteousness unchecked. And that becomes evil. It's righteousness that converts into vengeance. And that vengeance becomes demonic. So we don't get to blame the devil in Judaism. We get to blame God. It's even better. And also that chesed unchecked, that mercy unchecked, also leads to a terrible world. It leads to a world in which we can't do justice. And what I love about your book and what I love about the characters in the book is that it's exactly that tension. And it's that tension that goes unresolved. It mutates, it changes, it moves, it adjusts. It's over here a little bit sometimes and over here a little bit, but it's never resolving itself. And you never give the audience the resolution. And I think that's my Judaism. We will not get that resolution. And until Messiah comes, and keep waiting. But I love the idea that, at least for me and my Judaism, it's never that I get to have some reconciliation where I get to sit comfortably and say, yep, I did the just thing. Yep, I was merciful. It's always the tension. The theology is a theology of tension, of dialectic. And I love the fact that in your story, you let that sit, and you let that make the reader uncomfortable, and you say, at the end, I'm not going to give you an answer, because that's a betrayal of Judaism. I can write that in the book now.
I want to open it up for questions from the audience.
Yes.
So the main protagonist is named Lynn. So when we talk about Lynn and his unrighteousness or his righteousness, this is kind of a broader question, is if that tension that is mentioned by Dr. Sledge is ever resolved, does the golem lose his power based upon his no longer being around what is righteous? And so I guess that's more of an open-ended question, but kind of thinking about how the golem operates and what gives the golem power or doesn't give the golem power, does it shift? So I guess, yeah, that's what I got.
I mean, in my conception of the golem in the book, his power is not dependent, as I think you're suggesting, on the nature of his creator's righteousness. If anything, I think the golem quickly spirals out of the control of his creator. And that's something that happens frequently in stories of the golem as well, when he's not a housekeeper anyway. Nowadays you're most likely to hear the golem referenced as sort of a metaphor for artificial intelligence. Because again, you open up like Wired magazine and they'll be comparing AI or ChatGPT to a golem. Because it is, again, as Justin said, the outpacing of morality by technology. I'm interested in the formulation you're suggesting, that there's sort of this link between the soul of the golem's creator and the actions of the golem. If that were there, he'd be much easier to control, and he wouldn't, I think, represent many or possibly all of the things that, to me, he most fundamentally does represent. But it's an interesting idea, and I like it.
I would say that you do it in an interesting way, in that the golem is the result of this ancestral trauma. There's always been the one golem. And that's, again, incredibly Kabbalistic, not a coincidence, I believe. Because, again, in Kabbalah, there's the idea that your soul is not, this is not your first rodeo. We, in Kabbalah, we have the idea of Gilgul, of the souls have rolled. And in fact, not only are the sins, not only are you responsible for dealing with your own sins, but you have to go to do the metaphysical work of figuring out all the sins that you've done in the past, and that's your task in tikkun olam. So this is a really famous, and you can go to people in the world who will charge you a lot of money to tell you about the sins of your past life in Svat. And the idea is, we're all, in this way, the way you said, there's always been the one golem. Well, there's always been the one Jew. And it all goes back to that source, and you're carrying it all around. And I love the idea that for your golem, they are carrying it around, but it's us carrying that weight. And I think that to think about ancestral trauma not as some kind of epigenetic thing, but to carry it in terms of a metaphysical weight is a very powerful idea. And I love this idea that it's in there, you're carrying it, and that is the unique burden of the Jew.
So speaking of epigenetics, you actually have a almost novel inside of your novel. Yeah. And so there's a moment in the beginning that I thought was really interesting, where the main character, Len, who you describe as like a modern-day schmuck, and he's pretty high at this point, and he's thinking about a book that he wants to write. And it's a book about epigenetics and how trauma is kept inside of us, like in our DNA. And the concept is that you can sell your trauma and that people can buy your trauma. Trauma eaters is what you call them. And so this market begins of buying and selling other people's trauma. And then Len says, well, but I'll never write the book. And then immediately after, the golem is created. So why did you do that?
Most novels don't begin with a summary of a different novel. It's kind of just like me and Roberto Bolaño on that, I think. Well, it's interesting. The impetus for me to write this book was kind of the realization that two ideas that I was trying to work out separately could come together in a certain kind of way. Idea number one was simply the comic premise of a golem created by a guy utterly unqualified to make a golem, you know, who's thrashing around and yelling at him in Yiddish. But that's like a Saturday Night Live skit. The kind that's funny for the first 2 minutes and then drags for the next 9 minutes, and you're like, when is the musical guest coming on? And then very much separate from that, I was trying to work out the underpinnings of a sort of science fiction, speculative future novel about epigenetics, very similar to the one that Len cannot figure out either, in which, as you say, epigenetics becomes proven science, which it kind of already is, but the next step is that the moments that the trauma enters the DNA record, we become able to pinpoint. The way that you can cut a tree down, look at the rings, and see exactly when the fire happened. And then you begin to be able to litigate and sue around that trauma. You can ask for reparations. This transforms the world economy, and then the next innovation is the transplanting of traumas from one individual to another, because people want to receive the payout. Other people want to stash it, see how the political winds blow, see if you're judged as less than if you have this trauma, see if you receive some kind of benefit from having it, make a decision later. But then, unexpectedly, these traumas, when transplanted, begin to be things that the transplantees can actually see. So suddenly they are experiencing whatever that original trauma was from hundreds or thousands of years ago. And in some cases, it's driving them crazy. And in other cases, they are in a position to sell back the memories that they now have stewardship over to the people in whose families they originated who can't access them. And then weird religious cults like the trauma eaters pop up. It was a very heady and bugged out concept that I couldn't really wrap my mind around. I had a premise, but like no plot or characters, which is a problem. Not to get too technical, but for a novel, that's a problem. And then I woke up one morning and realized that if the golem was this repository of memory and trauma, I could kind of do everything I wanted to do in that novel, in the golem novel, and it would give it some weight and depth. So I sat down that morning and wrote a 4-page outline. I sent it to my agent, who responded with a 1-line email. He said, "The golem market is dead." It's like, thanks, Richard.
Or deactivate.
You just had to reactivate it.
See, we were there with that. Okay, yes. Do you want to?
I'll bring it to her.
You know, asking people that travel.
I think it can travel.
I have a loud voice. No.
Not that loud.
Okay, this is a somewhat practical comment question. So obviously there's a lot that goes on in Yiddish because of where the golem comes from and the Muri character, who's fabulous. By the way, the book is absolutely amazing, hysterical, and will make you think. So you have to read it. But there are places where there's Yiddish, but it's not Muri translating. And of course, I went immediately to Google Translate, and it didn't work. Why'd you do that?
Why did I have like untranslated Yiddish in the book?
Some of us are second, third, fourth generation.
Let me be clear. I don't speak Yiddish at all. This would be a good time to give a strong shout out to my good friend Eddie Portnoy, who was the translator of all the Yiddish in the book and was on call 24/7. At any time of day or night, I would text Eddie and be like, "Eddie, how do you say rip his arms off in Yiddish?" And he'd respond. And also Eddie would like ask me questions about the context. If I was like, "How do you say abomination?" He would be like, "Well, what kind of abomination?" And make me drill down on exactly what I wanted. Frankly, I wish I had someone to do that for me in English. The reason is that I wanted the reader to experience the same level of confusion that Len often feels when the golem is speaking Yiddish. Len doesn't understand it either. You know, sometimes in a movie, the filmmakers will make the choice to present you with a foreign language without subtitles. And it puts you in a state of confusion. It makes you think differently. It makes you take some guesses, but it also allows you to sort of let this language and this sound wash over you. And I guess that's the experience I wanted the reader to have, except for the reader who speaks Yiddish.
So, the golem is a creation by Jews to defend the Jewish community, is embedded within the Jewish community. Is the golem himself a Jew?
The question is the golem himself a Jew?
Well, he doesn't look Jewish.
Neither do I.
That's a great question. It brings to mind one of the only bits of golem folklore that actually made it into the book, which is a story of a rabbi, I believe in Odessa, who is always sort of traveling the treacherous countryside. So he makes a golem to protect him. And he travels with it for years, but he always deactivates the golem on the Sabbath so the golem does not desecrate the Sabbath. That's as close as I've got. I'm sure Justin can do much better.
Consult your local rabbi. I can see a couple. I really don't know. If the golem doesn't convert to Judaism and doesn't come out of a Jewish ima, I'm saying no. But again, I'm not a rabbi, thank God. I got that covered back there. That's the rabbi corner. Go ask them. There in the darkness.
Are there other questions?
3 rabbis, so if anyone wants to create a golem, we can.
4 opinions.
I hear a golem.
I will say that if
creation.
you, I don't know if the rabbis can make a golem or not, but I do have the books up here if you want to flip through them of how traditionally these would be the books that would have been used by at least traditional rabbis who may or may not have been high. Probably were, how they make golems. So if you just want to flip through them and sort out making a golem, you're
Will you
welcome
talk
to.
to us about your books, actually?
Yeah, so this is a copy of Sefer Yetzirah, which is the Book of Formation. It's probably the most obscure and powerful book of Jewish magic, for lack of a better word, ever written. It's the commentaries on this book that become the ground floor for how golems are created. So it's the instructions for how to make a golem, who can do it, etc. And the other book is a book of Jewish demonology, in which golems are mentioned, and there's a debate about to what degree golems and demons, shadim, can be used to the degree to which you can control them to make them do things. So Jews are very interested in not doing a lot of work, and you get golems and demons to do your work for you, which I would encourage you also. So one of these is a historical volume. This is a modern reprint, but it contains the instructions in Hebrew, at least, for if you want to make a golem.
Okay. Unless there's another question, which I can't really see in the lights, then join me in thanking Justin and Adam.